Hey guys, tonight we wander into a world that feels both familiar and completely alien, the wild, and sometimes ridiculous legal systems of the Middle Ages. Imagine yourself dropped right into a crooked cobblestone street, the air thick with wood smoke, and the clang of a distant church bell. You're not armed with modern logic or legal counsel, only the itchy wool on your back and the hope that no guard points a finger your way. You probably won't survive this, at least not without racking up a fine or two for crimes you didn't even realize existed. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love if you left a comment below telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to know just how far these little bedtime journeys reach. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing at the gates of a bustling medieval town, somewhere in Europe, around the 14th century. The guards give you a side-eye, not because you look suspicious, but because everyone looks suspicious in a time when being out of place is practically a crime. Here, the first thing you need to know, laws back then weren't just about keeping peace. They were about controlling people in ways you might find absurd, terrifying, or downright hilarious. You shuffle through the market square, ears filled with the sound of vendors shouting, "Fresh bread, only slightly burned," and fine cloth from Flanders. Each stall, each trade, and each outfit around you is policed by a stack of rules thicker than the bread crusts. One mainstream fact: medieval towns were run on something called borough charters, little documents that spelled out dozens of rules specific to that town alone. Break one, and you weren't just fined. You might be tossed in the stocks where local kids could throw rotten vegetables at you. Charming bedtime imagery, right? And yet, this wasn't seen as unusual. In fact, people trusted laws to maintain cosmic order. You might laugh at the idea of putting a pig on trial for knocking over a child, and we'll get to that in another section. But at the time, it felt perfectly reasonable. The universe had rules, so naturally society needed rules to mirror them. As you walk along, let's toss in a quirky tidbit. In some regions of France, there was a law against singing rude songs about the local lord's hairstyle. Yes, apparently medieval barbers weren't the only ones who had to tread carefully around a bad haircut. That tiny scrap of parchment law meant your freedom could hinge on whether your drunk uncle decided to belt out a parody at the tavern. You breathe in the smoky air, step over a pile of horse manure, and notice something else. Laws didn't just punish wrongdoers, they often reminded people of their place. They made sure peasants stayed peasants, merchants stayed merchants, and nobles got to strut around pretending they were ordained by God. Historians still argue whether these laws were primarily about morality or just a convenient way for elites to keep everyone else in line. It's probably both. Morality makes a neat excuse when your actual goal is social control. A bell tolls in the distance, not the church bell this time, but the curfew bell. It's a sound that would make your stomach sink if you were caught out after dark. You can imagine yourself sprinting for the inn, cloak trailing behind, because after that bell rang, anyone still wandering the streets was fair game for suspicion. Sometimes suspicion itself was enough to land you before the magistrate. You pause at a stall selling rough wool cloaks. The merchant eyes you, and you notice he's measuring out fabric with a little stick. That's not because he's meticulous. It's because the town's bylaws demanded exact measuring rods, standardized to avoid cheating. The bread police, the ale tasters, the cloth inspectors, entire jobs existed just to make sure nobody shortchanged the community. Sure, it sounds like public safety, but it also created endless loopholes where rivals could accuse each other of breaking minor laws. Imagine a medieval version of Yelp reviews, but instead of stars, you get dragged into court. And speaking of court, picture it. A dimly lit hall where a stern judge presides over everything from petty theft to gossiping about your neighbor's cow. The cases could be dead serious, like disputes over land that determined survival, or they could be absurd. There's even record of someone being fined for throwing dung across the street, medieval littering, if you will. Oddly enough, you're probably breaking several of their ordinances just by standing there gawking at everyone. Now let's play with a thought. You, a time traveler, decide to test the limits. Maybe you wander through the town wearing a bright purple cloak. Uh-oh, that shade might be restricted to nobility. Congratulations, you've just violated a sumptuary law without even realizing it. Expect a fine you can't pay, or worse, a public humiliation that makes everyone laugh while you're forced to wear the cloak inside out. A donkey brays nearby, pulling a cart of turnips. Its owner is muttering under his breath, clearly unhappy. Maybe he's been fined already today for selling them at the wrong spot in the market. You, meanwhile, glance at the cart and wonder how many of those turnips are legal tender. Because yes, bartering was not only common, it was often the source of disputes that led to some of these weird laws in the first place. As the evening rolls in, you sense the weight of rules pressing down. It's not just about survival anymore, it's about staying invisible. Keep your clothes dull, your mouth shut, your bread measured right, and your donkey tied up. Maybe you'll make it through one medieval day without winding up in a pillory. Maybe. But here's the ironic part. All these rules, bizarre as they sound, formed the backbone of what we now think of as structured society. Without them, towns would have been chaos. With them, towns were, well, slightly less chaotic, but also extremely unfair if you weren't born into the right class. It's a paradox you carry with you as you settle down on that lumpy straw mattress. Hopping tomorrow, you don't accidentally sneeze in the direction of a noble. Because yes, even that could be interpreted as disrespect in some places. And so, the first whispers of medieval law have settled into your bones tonight. You're in the system now, whether you like it or not. You wake the next morning, stiff from that straw mattress, only to realize that even what you're wearing might put you on the wrong side of the law. In the Middle Ages, clothing wasn't just fashion. It was an announcement of your rank, your wealth, and your permission to exist in society. And here's the twist. If your outfit sent the wrong message, you could be fined, shamed, or even tossed into court. You tug at your tunic, which looks ordinary enough to you, but the local authorities might disagree. Welcome to the realm of sumptuary laws, the great medieval fashion police. These laws dictated who could wear what fabrics, what colors, and even how wide your sleeves were allowed to be. Purple, reserved for the highest nobility, sometimes the royal family only. Fur, sure if you were rich enough to afford it, but heaven forbid you were the wrong class flaunting mink or sable. Wearing something above your station was more than a faux pas. It was legally forbidden. Here's a mainstream historical fact. In 1363, England's King Edward III issued a series of sumptuary laws that tried to control the entire spectrum of dress, from knights down to farmhands. The idea was that your social rank should be instantly visible by your clothing. A peasant wasn't supposed to be mistaken for a wealthy merchant, and a wealthy merchant wasn't supposed to be mistaken for a knight. Each layer of fabric, each embroidery stitch, was another thread in society's pecking order. You stroll past a tailor's shop where bolts of cloth hang like forbidden treasures. One merchant whispers to another that velvet has been outlawed for commoners. You suddenly glance at your sleeves, wondering if they're too extravagant. Wide sleeves might signal arrogance. Narrow sleeves, maybe too humble. It's exhausting just keeping up with the code. And here's a quirky tidbit to make you chuckle. In some Italian cities, laws restricted the length of women's trains on dresses because sweeping long fabric down a dusty street was considered excessive luxury. In Florence, there was even a limit on how many buttons could adorn a gown. Too many buttons? That was a crime of vanity. Imagine modern police ticketing you for excess zippers. Of course, historians still argue whether these laws were ever strictly enforced. On parchment, they look terrifyingly specific. But in daily life, some towns were stricter than others, and bribery could work wonders. A noble might turn a blind eye if you paid the right tax or offered the right gift. That's another layer of absurdity. Rules existed partly to extract money. You want to wear fur even though you're not allowed. Pay the fine, consider it the medieval version of a luxury tax, and strut on. As you wander deeper into town, a group of guards stops a man wearing a crimson cloak. He's no noble, just a well-off merchant trying to look important. The guards yank him aside, announce his violation to everyone in the street, and fine him heavily. Worse, he has to stand in the square while people jeer at him for playing above his station. You catch his eyes for a second, they're full of humiliation. This wasn't just about fashion, it was about public shamming. You duck away quickly, heart thumping, realizing that your own tunic might get you into trouble if someone decides why. Imagine this, a medieval courtroom, the judge sternly peering down, scribes ready with quills, villagers packed into wooden benches. And what is the accusation? Someone's duck quacked too loudly at night and disturbed the neighbors. As ridiculous as it sounds, laws involving animals were real. In parts of Europe, not only humans but also pigs, goats, and yes, even ducks could be put on trial. If your goose trampled someone's crops or your rooster crowed at the wrong time, you might find yourself fined or dragged into an absurd legal battle. There are even records of entire swarms of insects being summoned to court. Yes, you heard right. Judges would literally demand that locusts or rats appear to answer for their crimes of eating grain or destroying fields. Of course, the animals never showed up, but the ceremony was still taken seriously. For a medieval peasant, this wasn't just comedy, it was costly. If your animal was guilty, you might lose it, pay a fine, or worse, be branded as a careless villager. And remember, these fines weren't small. They could be the difference between surviving the winter or starving. So next time you complain about your neighbor's barking dog, be glad you don't live in a world where you'd be standing in front of a judge defending the honor of your noisy chicken. In the Middle Ages, clothing wasn't just about style, it was about status. Who you were, what you could afford, and even what you were allowed to wear was carefully controlled by law. These were called sumptuary laws. If you were a peasant, forget about wearing silk, velvet, or fancy fur trims. Those were reserved for the wealthy and the nobility. In England, laws stated that only the royal family could wear ermine, a luxurious white fur, and only knights could wear certain kinds of spurs. Even the colors of your clothes mattered. Deep purple, for example, was practically off-limits unless you had serious wealth. The idea was to keep everyone in their place. A shoemaker couldn't dress like a lord, and a merchant's wife couldn't look like a countess. If you broke these rules, you could be fined heavily, and sometimes your clothing would be confiscated on the spot. Imagine walking through town in your illegal velvet hat and having an official rip it right off your head. Embarrassing and expensive. But here's the irony. Merchants, who were technically below nobles in rank, often had more money than lords. So they'd try to sneak in silk linings or subtle gold thread to show off wealth without getting caught. It was a cat-and-mouse game between social climbers and the medieval fashion police. So yes, back then, wearing the wrong outfit wasn't just a bad style choice. It could land you in court. If there was one thing medieval people couldn't live without, it was bread. But bakers had to follow some of the strictest laws in history. In England, there was the Assize of Bread and Ale, first written in 1266. This law made sure bakers didn't cheat customers. The weight of a loaf had to match the official price of grain. If grain prices rose, loaves got smaller. If grain prices dropped, loaves got bigger. And woe to the baker who tried to shortchange people. If caught selling underweight bread, they could face heavy fines, or worse, be put in the pillory. That meant being locked in a public wooden frame while the townsfolk threw rotten food at you. Some bakers even practiced what's called the baker dozen, giving 13 loaves instead of 12, just to make sure they never accidentally cheated a customer. That extra loaf could save them from serious trouble. The same went for ale. If your beer was weak or overpriced, the local ale tasters, yes, that was a real medieval job, would report you, and you'd face punishment. So next time you grab a loaf from the bakery, remember, you've got it easy. At least no one's weighing your bread with the threat of a public shamming. When we think of medieval banquets, our imagination tends to run wild with endless tables piled high with roasted boar, golden goblets brimming with wine, and lords and ladies feasting until dawn. But the everyday reality of food in the Middle Ages was far less glamorous and far more revealing of the society itself. What you ate, how much you ate, and even when you ate were all determined by your social class, the church calendar, and the changing of the seasons. For peasants, the diet was simple, repetitive, and heavy on bread and pottage. A typical meal might include coarse rye bread dipped into a thick vegetable stew, sometimes flavored with a scrap of salted pork if fortune smiled on them that week. Meat was scarce for common folk, not only because it was expensive, but also because strict hunting laws prevented peasants from catching wild game. Instead, they relied on cabbage, onions, beans, and barley. Even beer was consumed daily, often weekly brewed, since clean water was not always available. At the other end of the social ladder, feasting among nobles was as much about politics as it was about food. Banquets became stages where wealth and power were displayed. Exotic spices like saffron and cinnamon were imported at great expense from the East, sprinkled onto roasted venison or swan to impress guests. Feasts might last for hours, with course after course presented, accompanied by musicians, jesters, and elaborate displays such as pies filled with live birds. These spectacles reinforced hierarchy, reminding everyone present who held power and resources. But food wasn't just about survival or status. Religion dictated the medieval calendar of eating. With nearly half the year marked by fasting days, Christians were required to abstain from meat, turning instead to fish, eggs, and legumes. This gave rise to entire industries devoted to preserving fish or transporting salted herring inland. The rhythm of feast and fast created a spiritual discipline that shaped not only the body but also the economy. Medieval food tells us far more than what filled people's stomachs. It reveals how inequality was reinforced, how religion shaped daily rhythms, and how communities celebrated the rare abundance of a good harvest. For the weary medieval soul, a full stomach was never guaranteed. But when the tables did groan under the weight of bread, ale, and roasted meats, the feast became a momentary glimpse of heaven on earth. When you picture a medieval feast, you might imagine long wooden tables covered with golden roasted chickens, overflowing goblets of wine, and merry knights tearing meat apart with greasy hands. And yes, that's partly true. But the reality of medieval food was a little less glamorous and a lot more surprising. Let's start with the basics. For the average peasant, daily meals were far from feasts. Bread was the cornerstone of their diet, and I don't mean the fluffy loaves you find in a bakery today. Medieval bread was dense, dark, and often coarse, made from rye, barley, or oats rather than wheat, which was reserved for the wealthier classes. Sometimes, peasants baked bread mixed with beans, peas, or even acorns when grain was scarce. And yes, it tasted as strange as it sounds. Alongside bread came pottage, a thick stew made from vegetables, grains, and occasionally scraps of meat if you were lucky. Think of it as the medieval version of instant noodles, cheap, filling, and eaten nearly every day. To add flavor, peasants might throw in onions, leeks, or herbs from the garden. Salt was precious and expensive, so meals were often bland. Meat, contrary to popular belief, was not a daily staple for common folk. Chickens, pigs, and cows were valuable for their eggs, milk, and labor, so slaughtering them casually was rare. Most peasants might only eat meat during festivals or after a successful hunt, though hunting the king's deer could cost you your life. Fish, however, was more common, especially for those living near rivers or coasts. The church also required people to abstain from meat on certain days, making fish a practical alternative. Now let's step into the world of the wealthy. Nobles and royalty truly indulged in extravagant meals. Feasts were more than just eating. They were political and social events meant to display power and wealth. A lord might host a banquet with dozens of courses, each more elaborate than the last. Picture roasted swans with feathers reattached for display, pies filled with live birds that would burst out when cut, and jellies shaped into castles. These weren't just meals, they were edible performances. Spices played a big role in separating rich diets from poor ones. Imported from the East, spices like cinnamon, pepper, cloves, and nutmeg were incredibly expensive. To sprinkle pepper on your dish was a way of saying, "Look how rich I am." These spices also helped mask the taste of meat that was less than fresh, since refrigeration didn't exist. Drinks were equally telling. Clean water wasn't always easy to come by, so most people drank ale, yes, even children. This ale wasn't as strong as modern beer, but it was safer than untreated water. Nobles, meanwhile, preferred wine, often imported from France or Spain if they lived in Northern Europe. Drinking from a jeweled goblet wasn't just about quenching thirst, it was about status. If you ever fall sick in medieval times, don't expect a hospital like today. Instead, medicine was a mix of superstition, herbs, and strange rituals. Doctors believed in the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you had too much of one, they thought you'd get sick. Their solution: bloodletting. They'd cut you open or use leeches to balance your body. People also carried herbs and amulets to ward off evil spirits, since illness was often blamed on demons or bad luck. Surgery, if attempted, was terrifying. Without anesthesia, only strong wine and prayers were offered. Some treatments worked by accident, like garlic and honey for infections, but many were downright dangerous. In the medieval imagination, animals were far more than creatures wandering the fields or hiding in forests. They carried moral lessons, magical powers, and symbolic meaning that shaped daily life and religious thought. To a peasant, a fox might not only be a nuisance stealing chickens, but also a reminder of the dangers of trickery. To a monk, a lion was not just a beast from faraway lands, but a symbol of Christ himself. The medieval bestiaries, beautifully illustrated books describing real and mythical animals, were among the most fascinating texts of the age. They were not written as scientific guides, but as moral mirrors, using each creature as a way to teach lessons about sin, virtue, and the mysteries of creation. Take the unicorn, for example. Medieval people firmly believed in its existence, though none had ever seen one. It was thought that the unicorn could only be captured by a pure maiden, for the beast would lay its head in her lap and fall asleep. To the medieval mind, this was not just a curious fact about a mythical creature. It was a spiritual allegory about purity, Christ, and the Virgin Mary. Paintings and carvings of unicorns decorated manuscripts, churches, and even coats of arms, reinforcing the symbolic weight of the story. Other animals were equally infused with meaning. The pelican was believed to wound its own breast to feed its chicks with blood, a striking image used to represent Christ's sacrifice. The owl, shunning daylight, was often seen as a symbol of sin and those who rejected the light of truth. Even the humble dog was celebrated for its loyalty, becoming a representation of faithfulness and friendship in both religious texts and noble heraldry. These interpretations reveal a society that blurred the lines between the natural and the supernatural, between observation and moral instruction. But alongside symbolic meaning, animals also carried practical weight in the medieval world. Horses were essential for farming, travel, and war. The type of horse you had reflected your station. A noble knight would ride a destrier, powerful and trained for battle, while a peasant would make do with a smaller draft horse for pulling plows. Cattle, sheep, pigs, and chickens filled the barns and fields, forming the backbone of the medieval diet and economy. Yet even these animals were surrounded by superstition. If a cow stopped giving milk, villagers might suspect witchcraft rather than illness. If a pig acted strangely, some believed it might be possessed by spirits. Exotic animals sparked even greater wonder. Pilgrims, traders, and crusaders brought back tales of elephants, giraffes, crocodiles, and apes, creatures that most Europeans could hardly imagine. When a real elephant was gifted to a European king, it caused a sensation, drawing crowds who traveled miles to see it. Such beasts seemed like living proof of the far reaches of God's creation, and they often became symbols of power and prestige for rulers. Some rulers even kept menageries, collecting animals as a way to showcase wealth and global reach. Medieval bestiaries also included creatures that never existed but were treated as real. The basilisk, a serpent so deadly its gaze could kill, haunted the imagination. The manticore, with the body of a lion, the tail of a scorpion, and the face of a man, was another favorite. These monstrous beings often symbolized sin, heresy, or the dangers lurking in the world. They reminded readers that the world was full of threats both seen and unseen. Interestingly, descriptions of these mythical beasts often sat alongside real animals like hedgehogs and cranes, showing how blurred the line between fact and fantasy truly was. The medieval fascination with animals also extended into medicine and magic. Parts of animals were used in remedies and charms. A ground-up unicorn horn was said to cure poison, though in reality it was often the tusk of a narwhal. Wolf liver might be used in a potion to heal, while snake skin could ward off illness. Superstitions shaped everyday practices, and some remedies lingered for centuries despite their questionable effectiveness. Animals even influenced law and religion. In some strange cases, animals could be put on trial for crimes. Records exist of pigs being executed for attacking humans, with the community treating them almost as if they were people bound by moral laws. These trials, odd as they sound, reflected the medieval view that the natural and human worlds were deeply interconnected under divine order. Yet not all of medieval animal life was bound up in mystery. People relied on animals daily in very practical ways. Cats, though sometimes feared as companions of witches, were kept to control rodents. Birds, particularly pigeons and doves, provided both food and communication. Falconry became a popular pastime among the nobility, with entire manuals written on the training of hawks. Dogs not only guarded flocks and homes, but also provided companionship in ways not too different from today. The symbolic and practical roles of animals worked hand in hand. They provided food, labor, and defense, but they also reminded medieval people of spiritual truths, moral dangers, and the mysteries of God's creation. To live in the Middle Ages was to live in a world where every creature, from the smallest mouse to the mightiest lion, carried meaning far beyond its flesh and bone. As centuries passed, these ideas about animals began to shift. The Renaissance brought more scientific observation, and the age of exploration revealed that many mythical beasts did not exist. Still, the medieval legacy of animals as moral teachers and symbols of divine order lingered, coloring art, literature, and folklore for generations. In the end, the medieval relationship with animals was as complex and layered as the society itself. To them, animals were not simply background noise in the countryside but active participants in a cosmic drama. Each bird's call, each beast's behavior, could be read as a sign, a warning, or a lesson. In their eyes, to understand animals was to glimpse the mysteries of creation, and to ignore their meaning was to risk being blind to the deeper truths of life. When we think of the Middle Ages, our minds often drift to knights in armor, towering castles, or plague doctors in beaked masks. But the everyday reality of medieval life was shaped just as much by what people ate, or more accurately, what they could not eat. Food was more than sustenance. It was identity, status, and even survival. The diet of a noble differed vastly from that of a peasant, and this gulf revealed not only health differences but also power and privilege. For peasants, bread was life. The type of bread they consumed told a story of class: coarse, dark loaves made from rye or barley for the poor, while the wealthy could afford soft, white wheat bread. But even bread was not always guaranteed. Failed harvests meant famine, and famine was a recurring guest in medieval Europe. During lean years, desperate people mixed their flour with acorns, beans, or even ground-up bark just to make something resembling food. Meat, contrary to modern imagination, was rare for the commoner. While nobles dined on roasted boars, venison, and swan, peasants might only taste pork during festivals or feasts. Hunting rights were reserved for the elite. Killing a deer from the king's forest could cost a peasant his life. Instead, peasants relied heavily on pottage, a thick stew made from vegetables, grains, and whatever scraps they could manage. This dish was endlessly adaptable, sometimes nutritious, sometimes barely edible. Nobles, meanwhile, reveled in extravagant banquets, not merely to eat but to display wealth and power. Dishes were flavored with exotic spices like cinnamon, saffron, and pepper, imported at great cost from the East. A meal might include elaborate sugar sculptures, peacocks redressed in their feathers after roasting, or pies that released live birds when cut open. These meals were performances as much as they were nourishment. Religion also deeply influenced diet. The church imposed strict fasting days, including Lent, when meat and dairy were forbidden. This gave rise to creative substitutions. Almond milk, for instance, became a popular alternative, particularly among the wealthy. Fish was considered acceptable, and so it became central to many medieval diets. Inland peasants might consume salted or dried fish, while coastal towns thrived on fresh catches. The ability to afford fish or almond milk again highlighted status differences. Water, surprisingly, was not the main drink for most people, as it was often unsafe. Instead, ale and beer were consumed daily, even by children, because brewing made the liquid safer. Nobles preferred wine, imported from France or produced locally in vineyards, and its quality reflected status. Malnutrition was rampant among peasants. Lacking vitamins and protein, many suffered from stunted growth, weakened immune systems, and diseases like rickets or scurvy. Meanwhile, nobles who gorged on fatty meats and sweet dishes faced their own problems, from gout to obesity. The table became a stage for inequality, each meal silently reinforcing social hierarchies. Even within monasteries, food was both a necessity and a reflection of discipline. Monks ate in silence, often simple meals, but wealthy monasteries could be surprisingly lavish in their spread. Chronicles sometimes reveal complaints about monks bending fasting rules with creative loopholes, such as classifying certain animals, like beavers, as fish so they could be eaten on fasting days. The symbolism of food extended beyond sustenance. Feasts marked coronations, weddings, and religious festivals, binding communities together through ritual and spectacle. For peasants, the annual village feast was one of the few times they might eat their fill, a break from the constant hunger of daily